You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron. Now here's your host, Ethan Haristadoulou.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Greeks Gridiron. I'm Ethan Haristadoulou, and today, moving over from the NFC and jumping on over to the AFC, we are looking at the AFC South offenses and ranking them from 4 to 1. Just the offensive side of the football. So we're talking Colts, Titans, Texans, and Jaguars today, coming off the heels of doing the NFC South. I invite you all to comment down below whether or not you're a fan of these teams here. How would you rank these 4 teams' offenses? We're going through every single division doing offenses, and we're going to wrap back around. We're going to do defenses as well. So without further ado, diving in, like I said, AFC South offensive power rankings, 4 through 1, and after some heavy consideration, and this one does hurt me a bit because for those of you who have been around, I'm sure you know, for those of you who may be newer, I did grow up rooting for the Colts. I don't really consider myself much of a Colts fan anymore. The fandom kind of left me when Andrew Luck retired, and while they still have a place in my heart, I don't really care nearly as much as I did growing up, and at this point, I'm just kind of a fan of the league, and I enjoy really good football. But at number 4, Colts are sitting at the bottom of the list for me. And it's not because I don't think that this offense isn't constructed well. This is actually one of my favorite offensive roster constructions I've seen from the Indianapolis Colts in literal years. Honestly, probably since the Peyton Manning era, because I was never really in love with the offenses we had when Andrew Luck was in Indianapolis. So I will say that I'm definitely excited to see what the vast majority of this Colts roster is able to do, especially on the offensive side of the football. You look at the wide receiver room, Alec Pierce, really good deep threat, Michael Pittman, the big-bodied receiver, Mr. Reliable, Josh Downs, the slot guy, you have A.D. Mitchell, Ashton Dulin, another guy who's constantly coming up big in certain situations when you need him to. The offensive line, a little bit interested to see how things shake out there. Of course, Tanner Bortolini looks like he's going to be taking over at the center spot. You have Matt Goncalves over sitting at the right guard spot here. But I mean, of course, Quentin Nelson, Bernard Raymond, and Braden Smith on the opposite side of the O-line. Confident in what they can do. Jonathan Taylor, a stud. Love what he's able to bring to the table to the offense. There's not really a lot that I'm too worried about with this team offensively, but you'll notice I left out the most important piece of this entire offense, and that is going to be the quarterback position. I cannot stress enough how frustrated I am. And again, I don't really consider myself like a diehard Colts fan anymore. I want to see the Colts do well, yes, but how on earth are we going into this 2025 season with Daniel Jones and Anthony Richardson as the potential starting quarterbacks of the Indianapolis Colts? I cannot believe that that is the current situation that Indianapolis is in at this current moment. And it baffles me every single day when I sit here and I look at this roster, whenever it is that I'm looking at stuff related to the Colts, and I look and I go, man, this is such a really good unit. And then you go back to the quarterback spot, and I was never really sold on Anthony Richardson from the jump. I thought him being drafted by the Colts made a lot of sense because of his athleticism and skill set and what Shane Steichen brings to the table. But outside of that, to the day that he got drafted, I kind of thought it was a bit of a reach. Not a ton of starts through his collegiate career. And on top of that, he got hurt his first season, only played through, 4, maybe 5 games, if I'm remembering correctly. It was a really big up and down year last year with a lot of twists and turns that did not look favorable on his part. There's honestly, and I saw somebody make a comparison about this not too long ago, and I wish I could remember who it was, but it has stuck with me ever since I've seen it. Anthony Richardson is kind of like this year's Joe Milton, except he got drafted way higher than he needed to. I mean, Joe Milton, supreme athlete, great size at the position, and honestly had more experience than Anthony Richardson coming out of college. And it's not like Anthony Richardson lit up the world on fire while he was playing at Florida. Like, this was a guy that had 13 collegiate starts. So I cannot believe that this is the situation that the Colts are in, and it sucks. It sucks for Indianapolis, and it sucks to see it as somebody who grew up rooting for them and wanting to see the best for them. But right now, it's a situation where I look at this and, like, of course, you look at, like, the addition of Tyler Warren in this year's draft as well. The Colts finally getting the tight end that feels like it's been eluding them for the last handful of seasons that they could really need. They were obviously banking on guys like Mo Alley Cox for a while, who's obviously been really good and consistent for them over the years, but never quite like that elite level tight end. You had guys like Jelani Woods, extreme athletes, massive size, but couldn't stay healthy. Now you're looking at, again, Tyler Warren coming in, great guy to have over the middle of the offense, but I cannot sit here with a straight face and tell you that I have high expectations for an offense that could potentially be led by Daniel Jones, because at this point right now, there's nothing telling me that Daniel Jones can't beat out Anthony Richardson from his end. So if that's the direction the Colts are going, I'm off the wagon. Number 4. Moving into the number 3 spot, though, this is one I'm really looking forward to seeing because I do like a lot of the changes we've seen this team make, and that's going to be the Tennessee Titans, as they obviously go into this year's draft with the number 1 overall selection, and you have yourself Cam Ward coming out of Miami. He is the guy, and I understand completely why he wound up being the guy for this team. He was probably the closest to, like, the prototypical quarterback you could have asked for coming out of this draft here, and the numbers last season obviously looked really good as well. Over 4,300 yards passing, 39 touchdowns, 7 picks. Like, it all made perfect sense when things were said and done, especially in hindsight with some of the stuff that started to come out regarding Shedeur Sanders' pre-draft process. Obviously, Cam Ward separating himself, making him a no-brainer at number 1 for a quarterback-needy team like the Tennessee Titans. I'm really excited to see what he can do in Brian Callahan's offense. This is a unit that needed a lot of work this offseason and has seen a lot of work this offseason. I mean, the wide receiver room looks extremely different. You, of course, have Calvin Ridley, another 1,000-yard season for him coming off this past year. Touchdowns a little bit low, but I mean, 1,000 yards is 1,000 yards of production. You, of course, through the draft, Alec Aomanor. You also had Chim DK coming out of the draft as well for them. So 2 guys out of the 4th round. And Alec Aomanor was like the draft nerd's darling. A lot of people pegging him as like a late 2, early 3 guy, and everyone just gushing over the fact that Tennessee was able to get his talent in the 4th round. So, I mean, obviously some positives there. Free agent additions, you look at Van Jefferson and Tyler Lockett, who at this stage in his career, maybe not the same guy that he was 5-6 years ago with the burning speed, but he's got the hands, the production to back it up, and I think he can still game at this point here, so I'm not worried about his production slipping off again. He doesn't have to be that number 1 guy. You could even maybe just consider slipping him into the slot, let him work on the inside while you have Van Jefferson and Calvin Ridley working on the outsides. So I really like the wide receiver room construction. You got Chigakonkwo at the tight end spot. Running back room, of course, you still have Tony Pollard, who quietly had himself his career best 1,000 yards. It was 1,079. So good guy there to have out of the backfield. There's a lot to like about this unit. You got to look at the O-line, though. There is some concern there. You go, however, improve the unit, bring in Kevin Zeitler, who, I mean, if he wasn't injured, he's basically started every single game of his career. He started 297 games of the 298 games that he's played in the NFL. Anything else that he did not start for, it was because he could not play. Other than that, the guy has literally started basically every snap of his career. There is the big question mark at left tackle, the gamble. A lot of people eyebrows raising this offseason with Dan Moore Jr. and what he could potentially do with the left tackle spot. So that'll be definitely something to watch as well. Again, with a rookie quarterback, Dan Moore Jr. going to be charged with protecting him there. But overall, I look at this roster and I definitely see improvement. I definitely think it's better than it was last year, especially when you consider the quarterback situation. I was somebody who was well off the Will Levis train going into last season, and the fact that he was the guy that they were rolling with, I was not super thrilled about for Tennessee, and it turned out about how I expected it to. I was not really surprised as things started to unfold poorly very quickly with him under center. You obviously had the flip-flopping with him and Mason Rudolph. It was a bit of a disaster, and you could tell that it was a team that desperately wanted to find, because this is a new regime, obviously, that inherited Will Levis. This was a team that wanted desperately to get their guy to mold their quarterback in the system that they are trying to build there, and we saw a massive shift with a lot of new offensive pieces coming in and a lot of offensive pieces departing this offseason. So this year it feels more like what exactly Brian Callahan wants to have for his offense. I do think that winds up with some improvement here. because obviously Tennessee, one of the lowest points per game total last year. So this is just something that I can only see it really going up. And I mean, there's not really much else to do but go up for the Tennessee Titans, considering last year. I would assume turnovers go down. You see some more productive drives. You see some more points. So I like what Tennessee's doing here. I respect what they're doing here. And at this point, I like them at number 3. Going into number 2 and number 1, this is where I spent a lot of the majority of the time kind of weighing my options here, because I'm trying to decide between the Texans and the Jaguars. And I will say that I feel like both of these teams have a flaw in one way or another, that you could make the argument that either one of these teams does deserve to be at number 1 or number 2. But I do think that there is something that stands a little bit more true to me with one than the other. So I ultimately decided to go with the Jacksonville Jaguars as the number 2 offense. And again, I strongly believe that there is a case to be made with Jacksonville being the best offense going into this year for the AFC South. However, there is something that needs to happen here, and to put it simply, things just need to finally come together. And maybe now with Liam Cohen as the head coach, you finally have that happen in Jacksonville. There is a piece of me that is a little bit uneasy of how this marriage came to be, because there was a point where Cohen was going to stay in Tampa Bay and just keep working his magic with Baker Mayfield and company over there. But ultimately, things settled itself out, whether it was money, control, ultimately the firing of the old GM, whatever it may have been. It worked itself out, and Cohen's there in Duval, and he's going to hopefully lead this team into a far better direction that they've been in the last few years. And a lot of it starts with Trevor Lawrence and protecting him more than anything else. And I do like what we saw from Jacksonville. Bringing in Patrick McCarry from Baltimore. You go and you get Robert Hainsey for the center spot from Tampa Bay as well. I do think that was much needed along the offensive line. I don't know if that's going to be the final answers you need to really fortify that unit there, but we've seen the injuries, and just on top of that, you don't want this to be the scenario, but there is you need to protect Trevor Lawrence from himself kind of thing as well. And I think the Jacksonville Jaguars overall front office coaching staff last year did a really poor job of that. We saw Trevor Lawrence breaking down again, that unbelievable hit from Azeez Al-Shaair that knocked it, basically the game he came back, knocked him out for the rest of the season essentially. And they didn't say it was because of that, but I mean, he's not playing at 100%. You have something like that happen to him, you go, all right, let's just pull the plug on this dead season here. So I get it, but a little too late kind of thing. But this is where it needs to come together for Trevor Lawrence. I've been a guy that's kind of hammered the whole, I'm a believer in Trevor Lawrence. I think he should be a franchise quarterback in this league, and I think he still can be. And maybe now with a more offensive-focused guy like Liam Cohen, new age style of offense. I mean, you saw what they built in Tampa Bay with Baker Mayfield. I mean, the guy threw for 45 touchdowns last season, and Chris Godwin and Mike Evans were missing both at the same time and separately at various points throughout last season. So it's not like they had their true number 1 guys. And I mean, you saw what he turned Bucky Irving into in his first season in the NFL as well. So I'm expecting a far more potent offense here. And you look at the addition, of course, of Travis Hunter, and you brought in Brian Thomas Jr. last year. And Brian Thomas Jr. made a damn good case as being the best wide receiver at last year's draft, at least through the first year of this 2024 draft class's career. So you have Brian Thomas Jr., you bring in Travis Hunter, who unbelievable playmaker, able to play both ways. He doesn't even have to be the number 1. He can just be an excellent complement to what you've already seen from Brian Thomas Jr. I am not super sold at the tight end spot right now. The fact that Brenton Strange is your lead tight end, or maybe Johnny Munt or Hunter Long could be botting each other for snaps. So we'll see how that shakes itself out there. I like the running back room, Tank Bigsby, Travis Etienne. If those guys stay healthy, good there. Ultimately, though, it needs to come together for Trevor Lawrence, and that's the big thing that I'll be keeping an eye on for this team. But I like the direction. I like the new coaching staff. I've got a better feeling going into this season than I feel I have in years past, whereas I remember coming into the 2024 season basically asking the question of, is this the team that started off the 2023 season really strong, but ultimately tailed off at the end of that 2023 year? Or is it going to be like which version of the Jacksonville Jaguars were we going to get? I don't feel that same bit of caution that I had coming into the season last year. I feel a lot more confident about what Jacksonville has put together here, just from the coaching staff to the roster that they're putting on the field. And I think we're going to get a better product out of Jacksonville. So I'm looking forward to seeing it. And then last, of course, certainly but not least, the Houston Texans. And like I said, there are some flaws between the Texans and the Jaguars, and I think there's good arguments for both sides of who should be number one, who should be number two here. And the Texans' big and obvious flaw, and it is something that, don't get me wrong, I am very much nervous about, and I'll be interested in seeing how this plays itself out going through OTAs, going through training camp, through the preseason, as we're basically looking at an all-out war along the offensive line and who's going to be a starter and who's not going to be a starter. You look at the amount of additions and just changes that we are seeing in Houston right now with the addition of Cam Robinson, the drafting of Ariante Ursary, the addition of Laken Tomlinson, Ed Ingram, Trent Brown, and then you have the guys from last season as well, Blake Fisher, Juice Scruggs, Jarrett Patterson, Titus Howard. There is a full-blown just shift of what the offensive line could potentially look like this year. I don't think anyone's job is necessarily safe. You don't bring in that many new offensive linemen, and that's not even all the guys that they brought in. Those are just some of the bigger names that they brought in. But they brought in so many people this offseason, it feels like it's just going to be whoever plays the best, you're winning the job. Because honestly, and Texans fans, I hate to say I told you so here, I came out of last year's draft and free agency scratching my head a little bit, because going into the draft of 2024 and free agency of 2024, I pegged the Texans as a team that could maybe use a little more depth and maybe a little more juice along the offensive line. I got blasted for it. I was told all these guys were hurt in 2023, and it was going to be a much better unit once everyone's healthy and back in 2024, and it was objectively worse. So, with that all being said, I'm very intrigued at this massive battle we're going to see along the offensive line. I don't know how it's going to pan itself out. It does concern me because you want a stable offensive line going into year 3 of this offense with C.J. Stroud. And last season tied for 3rd most in sacks in the NFL with 54. Something needs to be done. And there is something that I do think could be key to this and fixing that problem. And that's going to be, of course, with new offensive coordinator Nick Caley. I think the offense needs to be designed to be a little bit quicker in the passing game. One of the biggest issues I think that you can just, when it comes to looking at numbers and pointing things out, when you watch back some of the tape from C.J. Stroud, 4th longest time to throw last season, where he was basically holding onto the ball on an average of about 3 seconds per play. To give you context, the fastest in the NFL was, I believe, 2.44, if I'm remembering correctly. I didn't write the number down, but that was Tua Tagovailoa at 2.44, an offense that is built on just rhythm and getting the ball out quick. That was the complete opposite of what it was under offensive coordinator Bobby Slowick, and I think that may have been part of the reason why he got fired, amongst some other things. But I think this offense needs to be schemed up to be a lot quicker. And on top of that, you went into this offseason trying to fix the O-line, but also bringing in a good group of pass catchers to help build out this wide receiver room, because obviously the loss of Tank Dell last season, who knows how long it's going to take for him to come back. But you go and you get a Christian Kirk. You go and get Jalen Noel and Jaden Higgins, 2 guys that a lot of people, again, the draft nerds, all really loved. And a lot of people praising them for being able to lock up both of those guys. You look at Jalen Noel, a lot of comparisons to a guy like a Tyler Lockett we talked about earlier. Jaden Higgins, a bigger body option. There's a lot that you can get from those 2 guys. It does feel weird seeing a team draft 2 wide receivers from the same school, because you think odds, what is the likelihood that 2 wide receivers from the same school coming out at the same time in the same draft class are going to both end up being hits? You would assume that odds are maybe it's only one of them more than both, or maybe none at all. I'm hoping for the Texans' sake it winds up being both, but I really like what this wide receiver room looks like here. You obviously have Nico Collins, and Christian Kirk's no slouch by any means. Yeah, there was, some injury issues are probably the biggest thing that's kind of held Christian Kirk back at this point. But he's the guy that's been productive while he was in Jacksonville and prior to that in Arizona. Definitely not a bad number 2 option to have alongside Nico Collins as Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel figure themselves out, and Tank Dell hopefully working his way back into the offense. So this is a good group of guys. The offensive line is my biggest concern, and it's something that, if you want to argue against Houston and say, I'd probably take Jacksonville over them just because I think their offensive line's a lot better and it all does start in the trenches, I get it. But I do like everything else that this offense is bringing to the table, and couple that with the fact that I'm a huge Joe Mixon fan. I love his game. For somebody who missed a decent amount of time last year due to injuries, still managed to get over 1,000 yards on the ground, another 300 yards through the air, over 4 yards per attempt. I mean, if he can stay healthy, this is a really complete unit skill position-wise. It's just a matter of what happens with this big battle we're potentially going to see for guys fighting for starting positions along the offensive line, because I would be hard-pressed to believe that all these guys got brought in strictly to just be depth behind the same unit that struggled last season. I think the ball's got to come out of CJ Stroud's hands quicker. The offense needs to be schemed to be a lot faster, shorter routes, quicker passes, things like that. And I do think with the talent you have on that offense, it'll absolutely turn into more so what we saw in CJ Stroud's first year and less of what we saw in CJ Stroud's second year. Hopefully. That's the optimistic point of view. But that's kind of what I'm looking at for the AFC South. Again, as always, appreciate it if you made it to the very end of the video. Comment down below. Let me hear from you. Thoughts, opinions. What am I getting right? What am I getting wrong? Do you agree and disagree? I'll see you all next time. Have a good one.